in the past millennium, I can recall two, when there were a change of population in the city. The first would be during the Crusader Wars, and the second would be in 1948, when Palestine ceased to exist and the State of Israel emerged as the only state in historic Palestine, and the rest of Jerusalem was annexed by the country of Jordan, or the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. This is my premise. Now, following up on this premise, Jerusalem, like many other places in the modern age, in the 19th century, was part, well, not like all cities, but it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And like many other places in the Ottoman Empire, the tide of times changed the nature of the city. Like all other Ottoman cities, it grew significantly, its population increased, and there were numbers that I believe Philistine gave in the morning about the doubling of the population, but not only in Jerusalem, but also in Smyrna, in Istanbul, in Beirut, in many other places. And naturally, with the developments connected with the entry of the city into the age of modernization, the city expanded beyond its historic walls from the kind of later part of the first half of the 19th century. So by the end of the Ottoman rule, the city was a, as we can see, how do I change? Do I have a... As you can see in the map over here, this is the old city of Jerusalem, but now the old city of Jerusalem over there, do I have a pointer on top? Is it? Okay, so this here used to be Jerusalem. Now this is a small part of the Jerusalem we knew. And outside of the city walls, there were entire neighborhoods built that hosted various kinds of people, and by kinds here I'm only referring to the religious diversity. There were Jewish neighborhoods, pre-Zionist Jewish neighborhoods that emerged in the city, and there were mixed Christian and Muslim neighborhoods that emerged outside of the wall, and Christian and Muslim and Jewish neighborhoods such as Rumeima, which was a multi-religious neighborhood at the time. Then comes the British Mandate, and the British Mandate, to my knowledge, particularly the beginning of the British Mandate under the High Commissioner Samuel, was the first to invent for us the terminology that we are still stuck with today, which is the terminology of Jews and Arabs. Before the British Mandate, there were Ottoman citizens, some of them Jews, some of them Christians, and some of them Muslims. And there were non-citizens as well who migrated to the city in that sense. But in line of the Balfour Declaration understanding and the policies of the British government, the term Jew meant a particular, or was on its way to mean a particular national community, and the rest were deemed to be called Arabs in that sense. So the use of Jews and Arabs is rather problematic. Still, focusing on 1948, we are forced to use this term, thus excluding Jews of Arab origins and Jews of Jerusalem, who would have been otherwise if there was no Zionist project and Jewish state, might have been part of the Arab identity at the time. We cannot be certain, but very likely trends were going in that sense. And at the same time, excluding or removing Christians and Muslims from the identity of the state that was formed later on in Palestine. Now, we come to 1947, and my colleague already outlined what happened and the nature of the partition plan, which talked about the corpus separatum separatum for Jerusalem. An important element of the UN Resolution 181, which is deemed as or called the partition plan, including for the corpus separatum, but also including all of historic Palestine, that it did not actually talk about moving populations, but talked about sovereignty. So a Jewish state and an Arab state would rule in certain areas, and the international regime would be set in another area, or a third area, the area of Jerusalem, but no transfer of population was envisioned. The plan was based on the fact that the majority of the Jews of Palestine would end up in the Jewish state, and the Arab state will have the majority of the Arabs of Palestine, that is the non-Jewish residents of Palestine. But there would be Jews in the Arab state, and there would be Christians and Muslims in the Jewish state. So that was the ethnic cleansing, so to speak, was not envisioned in that sense. Now, as has been highlighted earlier, of course, the State of Israel was created in May of 1948 after the termination, or maybe a few hours before the termination of the British mandate in Palestine. And the city of Jerusalem and the UN failed to implement its plan for Palestine, including its plan for the corpus separatum, as my colleague already highlighted. Instead, battles started to emerge in Jerusalem before the declaration of the State of Israel and before the entry of Arab armies in Palestine. By the end of April 1948, a significant portion of the western and southern suburbs, or western southern suburbs, not all of them, of Jerusalem were already in the hands of or under the control of the Zionist movement, later on to create its state, the State of Israel, and a significant number of non-Jewish residents from those parts were expelled or pushed out or left their neighborhoods at that time. And the battles raged within the old city. They were not battles between the Arab armies, invading Arab armies, so to speak. Particularly in this case would be the Arab Legion or the Jordanian army, but they were taking place between local militias, particularly Palestinian militias formed under the auspices of various groups, but I think the most important of them was Al-Jihad al-Muqaddas army, which defended the old city, particularly from the Zionist attacks on it. And only after the entry of the Arab armies, the Jordanian army, which stood only on Mount of Olives to the east of the city, with its commander, Glob, known as Glob Pasha, but I forgot his first name, I'm sorry. John, announcing clearly that he has no intentions of violating UN plans and entering Jerusalem. So the Arab parts of the city of Jerusalem, at least the old city particularly, survived under Arab control because of the local fighters within the city. And then when the Jordanian army entered the city, or the Arab Legion, its first act was to disband the Palestinian army known as the Al-Jihad al-Muqaddas and to collect their arms at the time. So I'm mentioning this not to condemn Jordan or far from it. I'm mentioning this to take the element of states fighting over a space out of the picture, because there are indigenous people whose lives are heavily influenced, and we cannot just simply reduce it to this is the Jordanian position and this is the Israeli position. I mean, there are these positions, but there were people who did not want their city, or at least parts of their city that they were able to defend, to fall to the control of a newly created state that does not represent them. And I think that is a very important element. Now, I'm going to focus on the fate of the Arab neighborhoods that fell under Israeli control or first Jewish Zionist control from late April, and then later on under the Israeli control at the time. Now, after the official partition of the city was divided, and in the western part, it fell under Israel's control, and in the eastern part, it fell under the Jordanian control. And a border was erected with one crossing point that we see over here, and that crossing point is known as the Mandelbaum Gate, named after a Jewish philanthropist who lived in a particular home. Was not his home anymore, but it became the headquarters of the international forces. And only foreign diplomats were able to cross back and forth between the two sides of the city. And on occasion, Christians from within the boundaries of Israel were allowed to cross and visit on holidays, Christian holidays, the eastern part, the Holy Sepulchre and other parts, and return. But for the most part, this, for the population of the city, this gate was a one-way road through which Palestinians would leave from West Jerusalem, never to return. At the time, and I'm talking here, I'm talking about more than 30,000 Jerusalemites who ended up on the eastern side of the city. But I'm also talking about the history of my own family, who only left in 1951 after not being able to take it any longer, being in the minority in their same neighborhood with strangers as their neighbors. This is another picture of, unfortunately, oh, sorry. I'm looking at both things here. So where do I direct it? Oh, I actually moved here with my screen a few times. So this is the Mandelbaum Gate. This is the crossing point. And I'll skip this one. Now, based on my research, I was able to collect, and some were already published, memoirs of Palestinians who remained in the western part of the city, who wrote about their lives in the period spanning, April, May 1948 up to the early 50s. And among those, we have two notable ones that I've used heavily. One is published, and it's called The Armenians of Jerusalem, very benign title, but really the memoir is about Palestinians who remained in the western part of the city under Israel control, and it's written by an Armenian Palestinian from West Jerusalem at the time, whose name is John Rose. And the second one is unpublished, will be published shortly in Arabic, and it is by Jirias Salti, who remained in his home in Al Baqa neighborhood of the city, which fell on April 26, 1948, to the eventually to the Israeli state. Eventually. Both document lives and hardship of Palestinians at the time. The memoir of Salti, we find, it's written the only part of the memoir that I was able to find. Actually, sorry, I say memoir, it's not a memoir, it's a diary. He wrote daily in his diary what was happening with him. So he mentioned, for example, that on 14th of May 1949, he wrote, "The situation is unbearable, and the memory of this day, which is a memory of, it's 1 year after the creation of the State of Israel. It was a Friday, and I was not able to go to my shop in the afternoon." He's recalling what happened a year before. "On this day, the Mujahideen, that is the Arab fighters, withdrew, and no one was left in the Baqa." We have photographs, and I do use photographs in my research as some sort of historical documents. And we have, this is a photograph from the attack of the Palmach, which is a Zionist organization, and I'm sorry, thank you. How do we do this? Oh, here. On the village of Ein Karem. The village of Ein Karem was a Palestinian village, an Arab village in the terminology of the time, that was under Israeli control, and it was depopulated. Its population was forced out. And from the Israeli archive, this is from the Israeli government press office archive, we see the looting of the village by, here are soldiers or fighters moving furniture outside from the city. We also see some of the attacks here from the photographs, Zionist attacks on Baqa. You would think they're attacking a major military installation, but they're simply moving from one house to the next. The city of Jerusalem and these neighborhoods were wealthy neighborhoods. Elite Palestinians lived in these neighborhoods, and about 30,000, many of them built new houses following all sorts of new architectural styles like the Bauhaus and others. And this is a photograph of the family of Zenaniri that lived in their house, which we can see their house over here before 48, and we can see it nowadays as part of Israeli Jerusalem in this sense. I guess maybe I should go back to this, or maybe I should just focus on the memoirs. The problem that we are told about, and I'm not going to read the text, so I'll just simply tell you that from those memoirs, we gather that out of the 30,000 residents of Jerusalem, of the western part of Jerusalem, the Arab residents, a handful, exaggerating here, but a small number remained in the city. And the small number varies. According to Ben Gurion, it's 2,000, his memoirs. According to one of the diarists that I'm talking about here, Salti, there were only 200 people. But according to other sources, they were estimated to be about 8,000. In this sense, we had a complete removal of the Palestinians from their homeland. And the new state issued a law in 1950, known, as you can see here, as the absentee property law, by which anyone who was not on their property when the state was declared and they were residents or citizens of other countries that were hostile to Israel at the time would lose their property and will be held by the absentee property administrator. And that is seen in the memoirs. Mr. Salti tells us, I'm going to move on this, and Mr. Rose, and I have only 5 minutes, so I don't have much time to read, so I'll just tell you quickly. They both tell us of encroachment on property, of Jewish residents coming to occupy houses and sometimes rooms in properties, confiscate or steal furniture from the houses, and there were attempts to scare the local population to force them to move to the Jordanian side of the city. We have many testimonials here, and we have also pictures of Yemenite Jews here moving furniture from one house to the next. But we basically have in the diaries evidence of massive looting. And then another important element, since my time is limited, is a law that was passed in 1949, by which the state, here is the map, by which the Palestinian residents of West Jerusalem were gathered into a particular zone that was called Zone A. So even those who stayed in their homes were removed from their homes, placed with other Palestinians in a restricted area in which they needed a permit from the military authorities to be able to leave it, to go outside and return. And looking at these diaries, it's like looking at our current situation with the post-Oslo period of Area A and Area B, and this is Palestinian, this is under joint control, etc., etc. But after the cancellation of the zone in 1950, when the residents who were moved into the zone, placed into the homes of other Palestinians, absentee Palestinians, and were made to pay rent, When they returned back to their homes, they found that their homes were already occupied by Jewish residents at this point. And many of them were unable to reclaim their homes or even to rent their homes now from the newly established political system. Let me go back to finish with one photograph that is dear to my heart. This is a photograph from early May 1948. This is a family, actually two families, waiting for the bus with some of their belongings to go to East Jerusalem, simply to an Arab area until the fighting is over. They seem to be dressed well for the occasion, as if they are going on a picnic or to a wedding or to something special. And one of them was a famous photographer, David Abdo, who happened to carry his camera and documented the short trip. Those, in fact, are Palestinian refugees. They went to East Jerusalem, but they were never allowed back to their home, seen in the photograph. And if you go on the Bethlehem Road or the Hebron Road, I think it's called, you would see the house now. It's still there. Contrary to the images we have of Palestinian peasantry being removed from their villages and placed in refugee camps, the loss of the urban space also took place in Jerusalem and in Haifa and in Jaffa and other places. And while the photograph might not show the trauma, but just knowing a little bit about the story of who these people are, emphasize once again the main trauma that people had to deal with. And why do I focus on this? Not only because I'm a historian and I'm interested in this particular period, but I am seeing that this process started in 48 but did not end. Now we have similar images of families, perhaps not as nicely dressed and waiting for the bus, but we have daily images these days of families being uprooted from their homes in East Jerusalem this time, based on some dubious claim often, of property or another. It is the process that took place in West Jerusalem is being repeated right now in East Jerusalem, and is being repeated in a way that if we learn anything from history, we need to learn that when you are expelled or you lose your right under the current political regime of the State of Israel, your right to stay in your home and in your neighborhood, it's lost. Hopefully not forever, but it looks like it's lost forever. So with this, I will end, and I'm sorry I took longer.